Welcome back, Sebastian here. So time for my power rankings for the British Grand Prix. So of course, as always, these power rankings are not just for the British Grand Prix, the most recent race, but also the last several races. So starting right away, number 20, staying in the same position as last race, is Nick De Vries. For De Vries, a bit of a tough weekend. But that being said, no big incidents like he's had the last couple of races. Was out qualified by Sonoda and was beaten by Sonoda as well. But that being said, the gaps were a bit smaller, especially in the race, and he did seem to be holding his own in the race. So a bit of a better weekend for De Vries, but still 20th. Now number 19, finally someone moving out of the bottom two spots. And this driver moves down one spot, and that is Kevin Magnussen. So for Magnussen, a really tough weekend in Britain. That being said, it was not really his fault. He had an issue in qualifying, mechanical issue in qualifying, and of course he also retired from the race. But that being said, I feel like recently, he's really been suffering in qualifying comparison to his teammate Nico Hulkenberg. And given that Hulkenberg's come from effectively 3 years off being a full-time driver, and given his age, he is in his mid-30s, he shouldn't be being out-qualified the way he is. So I do think that Magnussen needs to step up his game a bit in the coming races. Number 18, I think this driver had their best race in Formula 1 to date. They didn't get a point, but they were very, very close to getting a point. And that, of course, is Logan Sargent. So a bit of not a fantastic weekend, just not a great weekend. Did get beaten and was out-qualified by their teammate Alex Albon, but still a good weekend and definitely a good step forward, I thought. As we get to these European circuits that Logan has a lot more experience with from the junior series, I do expect him to be a bit closer to Albon in pace. So that being said, a bit of a promising weekend there, and hopefully coming up soon he can get his first points in Formula 1. Now 17th, moving down one position, bit of a tough weekend, and that is Wang Yuzhou. So for Zhou, a bit of a very anonymous weekend, as it is for many of these lower backmarker teams. If they don't really cause an incident, they're not really on camera, so it's really hard to say how they did. But for Zhou, he was beaten and out-qualified by Bottas, although Bottas was then disqualified and started behind him, but he was still beaten by Bottas. He was hurt as well by the timing of the safety car, but that being said, like I said in my review yesterday, I do think that being able to make your tires last so that you do have the opportunity to pit under a VSC or a safety car is a skill in itself. So for Zhou, I moved him down one position. So next, moving down 3 positions, been a really rough weekend for this driver again, and that is Lance Stroll. So for Stroll, beaten by his teammate in both qualifying and the race, finished 14th after getting a 5-second penalty. When I first did my review, I thought that was a fair penalty, but that being said, seeing that Gasly effectively cut him off and kind of forced him to go around onto that runoff area, I feel like it was a little bit of a harsh penalty. But that being said, I do think it's fair that he was given a penalty. He did come back very aggressively, made contact with Gasly, and kind of forced him to retire. So I do think it's a little bit fair on that part. That being said, for Stroll, it was a tough race. He lost out massively because of that safety car, and I do think he might have been able to get a 9th or a 10th place if he had pitted under the safety car with the other drivers. Number 15, another rough weekend, moving down one position, is Sergio Perez. So for Perez, 6th place qualifying, got knocked out in Q1, which should not be happening in Red Bull. He really needs to up his qualifying game. And honestly, I'm not really sure what to say about Perez in the qualifying. He was honestly pretty decent in qualifying the first 5 races of the season, and ever since then it's just gone completely downhill. And I don't think there's anything that's really changed fundamentally with the Red Bull car. I really think it's a psychological, it's a mental issue, just kind of getting that every last of a tenth. It's also possible that, as he gets older, and since qualifying has not been one of his strengths historically, it's just getting to the point where his qualifying as he gets older, and this does happen generally for F1 drivers, is that as they get older, qualifying generally does tend to get a bit worse. And given that Perez is not generally the best qualifier, even when he was in his even when he was younger. It's possible that he's just having a really, really steep decline. But that being said, he should be doing better. Shouldn't be getting knocked out in Q1. At bare minimum, he should be like top 4 in qualifying. Even since just compensating for the fact that some of the teams can be very close to the Red Bull in qualifying, like we saw with McLaren this past weekend. Number 14, a bit of a better weekend this weekend for Valtteri Bottas, moving up 1 spot. Had an okay qualifying by the standards of the Alfa Romeo this year. Out-qualified his teammate. Unfortunately for him, was disqualified for not having enough fuel in the car. It's a rule. It's just the way it is. It's the same rule that caused Vettel to be disqualified from Hungary in 2021. But that being said, race looked pretty good. Race pace seemed pretty decent as well, and he did beat his teammate Joe. Number 13, moving down 1 position, is Nico Hülkenberg. For Hülkenberg, tough weekend. Qualifying was pretty good, as it's been all the season. I have generally been very impressed with Hülkenberg's qualifying performances this year. Race was a bit much tougher though. He unfortunately had that bit of contact with Perez, damaged his front wing, and he had to come in and replace that. I think it was kind of a 50-50 move on both. I think Perez could have left a bit more space, and I do think that Hülkenberg could have been a little bit more cautious as well. Number 12, moving down 1 position, another tough weekend for this driver. That being said, I don't think it's his fault. I do think it's just that the car is really, really poor, and it's really hard for him to show what he can do. And that is, of course, Yuki Tsunoda. Beat his teammate in both the race and qualifying, but after kind of the start of the season where he was consistently being 11th, 12th, 13th, being very, very close to either being in the points or just outside the points, we've had quite a few races now where he's just kind of 14th, 15th, 16th, well outside the points. I think, unfortunately, that AlphaTauri is kind of falling further and further behind. And because the gap's getting a little bit smaller between him and De Vries, I think it's a little bit justified to move him down a little bit. Now, number 11, I think if I did this power ranking for just the British Grand Prix, this driver would easily be in the top 5. But this is doing kind of a, not necessarily a cumulative look, but it's a more recent look at the last 3 or 4 races. And that this driver moves up 6 spots, the biggest mover for this weekend, and that is Oscar Piastri. Absolutely fantastic result for him. He's going to be quite disappointed, though, I would expect, to finish 4th and not 3rd. That being said, it wasn't his fault at all. Simply got caught out with the timing of the safety car, and I do believe that Norris would have pit like a lap or 2 later, so it wasn't even a case of him not being able to manage his tires. It was just have them on slightly different laps, so that way you don't have to worry about double stacking them in the pits. So just really unfortunate timing with the safety car for Piastri. But that being said, I thought his drive this weekend in both qualifying and the race very mature, very calm, and he looks like a veteran out there, which is something that we don't really get often say about rookie drivers. And I would say at this point, he's probably the best rookie I've seen in F1 since Leclerc in 2018. I know Russell had a very good rookie season in 2019, but it was borderline impossible to really give comment about that year's Williams because we saw them so little on screen. They were so far off the pace of every other car, and it was basically just him and Kubica in a competition for who would not finish last. So moving on to number 10, top 10 drivers. This driver stays in the same spot, and that is Pierre Gasly. So for Gasly, qualifying was pretty decent, out-qualified his teammate Ocon, and looked to be able to score some good points in the race. He was even putting pressure on Alonso at one point in the Aston Martin, which I was not expecting. So a really good race for him, but then after the safety car, got in a bit of a ding-dong with Stroll. I think he kind of pushed off Stroll in that point where he got overtaken by Stroll at Stowe. Could have left a little bit more space on the outside, and then had that bit of a clumsy move, kind of battle with Stroll and Bale, which then resulted in the contact that gave him, that caused him to retire from the race. I don't think he was predominantly at fault, but I do think he could have played that sequence of events out a little bit better. But that being said, I'm fine with where he is. I'm going to keep him in 10th. Number 9, moving down 1 position. This is a bit of a tough race for this driver, and that is Carlos Sainz. So throughout practice and qualifying, Sainz honestly looked really good. I thought he was having a pretty decent race, but then the strategy kind of was pretty much a disaster for Ferrari today, I thought, or yesterday, I thought. And he really he really kind of suffered from that. He also seemed like he made a mistake. I don't know, I'm not sure what happened, but there was that sequence where he lost about 4 positions in like 4 corners. So that was not great. I'm not sure what happened there, but yeah, not great for Sainz overall this weekend. Number 8, moving down 1 position, a bit of a rough weekend after a pretty good string of races recently, and that is Esteban Ocon. So for Ocon, he was out-qualified by Gasly, he was impeded a little bit by Stroll, and then he had to retire with a mechanical issue. So nothing he could really do in the race. That being said, overall the pace I think was not quite as good as he's been demonstrating in the most recent races. Number 7, moving up 2 positions, I was honestly quite impressed with this driver, and that is George Russell. Looks set to be the lead Mercedes driver in the race until that safety car came out. I think he did a really good job of extending his soft tire stint as long as he did, longer than both the both of the Ferraris, I believe. And he looks set to be on over for a really good result. Of course, the safety car's timing kind of ruined that. But that being said, I thought he had a really good race overall. Number 6, moving down 1 position, is Charles Leclerc. So for Leclerc, I don't really understand what Ferrari's strategy was yesterday. He went on the mediums with George Russell behind him on the softs, and they decided to try to undercut him on those tires. So I really didn't understand that strategy. You go on the harder tire, you stay out longer. That's pretty simple. That's strategy 101 right there, and they weren't doing that. And it really cost them under the safety car as well, because they decided to opt for a 2-stop strategy. One of the few cars that did, and I think it really cost them at the end of the race, given that the tire drop-off was just not happening. And I think it would have been a lot better if he just stayed in that position and held that position. We saw with the McLarens that even though they were on used hard tires, the pace was still pretty good for them. So I think the pace, just overall, Leclerc honestly probably did the best he could. He's very good at this track historically. But that being said, I think Ferrari being Ferrari didn't help him today. Now number 5, moving up 1 position, a really excellent race for this driver, and that is Alex Albon. Now coming into this weekend, I don't think this was really a track that we thought that the Williams was going to be able to score points at. Lots of high-speed corners, and usually that requires a good amount of downforce to be able to be successful at this kind of track. That being said, Albon somehow made it work, looked really good all through the weekend, and practice especially looked good. Qualifying was a little bit worse off, but that being said, it was really, really tricky conditions in qualifying as the track was basically drying out through the session. I do think Albon had an absolutely fantastic race though, was chasing down Alonso and was holding off the Ferraris behind, which is something that I don't think any of us expected to say at the beginning of this year. Number 4, staying in the same position, is Lewis Hamilton. So for Hamilton, gets his home Grand Prix podium, I believe, 11th straight podium. Yes, 11th straight podium at his home Grand Prix, or his home track. I think there was an extra race in there in 2020. So excellent run for him. I do think he was a little bit lucky with that safety car, and I do think he would have finished behind Russell if we hadn't had that safety car intervention. That being said, still a pretty decent result for him as he moves up closer to 3rd in the championship. Number 3, moving down 1 position, is Fernando Alonso. So for Alonso, I don't really think Alonso did anything wrong to justify him moving down. It's just the driver that I have moved up. I think had such a phenomenal weekend, I just decided I had to move them up. So for Alonso, beat Stroll in both qualifying and the race, I was really to expect. The race was a lot more tricky than I was expecting. That race pace on that Aston was not good at all. And it seems like they tried to go for straight line speed as well to try to compensate for some of their drag deficiencies. But that being said, the tire wear and the tire life was not great, so I do think that Stroll and Alonso both had like decent races in that respect. But that being said, yeah, I think Aston kind of just messed up the setup for this weekend. Number 2, moving up 1 position on my power rankings, an absolutely fantastic result, finishing P2 in a McLaren, something I was not expecting at all. Coming into this weekend is, of course, Lando Norris. So 2nd on the grid, front row on the grid, came close to getting pole. It was 2 tenths or so, but of course, if Verstappen didn't nail that last lap, he could have been on pole position. Had an excellent start, led off the line, but was kind of inevitably overtaken by Verstappen. And when the safety car came out and he was kind of on a less than ideal strategy, I think he did an excellent job of holding off Hamilton behind and had some really nice defensive moves, especially that move where he defended from Hamilton at going into Copse. So of course that leaves us at number one, which is of course Max Verstappen. Qualified on pole, had a bit of a rough start, but that being said, after that he looked totally in control, looked like there was never really any doubt of him losing the race, and he finally gets his first British Grand Prix win. On top of that, he got 6 wins. He has 6 wins on the bounce now, which I believe ties him with only 4 other drivers to be able to have done that in F1 history, which are Ascari, Schumacher, Vettel, and Rosberg. So some really historic company there. So that's all for my power rankings for this weekend's British Grand Prix. Of course, I'll be back in a couple weeks. Hungarian Grand Prix, also another one of my personal favorites, even though the racing isn't usually as good as some of these tracks like Silverstone. It is a pretty interesting track. It is one of my favorites. So thank you so much for watching. If you want to watch more, please like and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. That's all, and I'll be back a bit later with, I think, a video I'm going to be doing on 2024 F1 grid. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.